The letter was stuck to my front door with a piece of tape that had frozen solid overnight, and when I peeled it off, a little chunk of my door's paint came right along with it. That should have been the first sign of how this whole thing was going to go. It was 7 in the morning, -4 degrees outside. There were 8 inches of fresh snow on the ground. My driveway wasn't plowed yet, and I was standing in my bathrobe and snow boots trying to read a piece of paper that was already starting to stiffen up in the cold. The letter was from the Maplewood Creek Homeowners Association, signed at the bottom in big loopy cursive by one Carol Whitmore, board member and compliance officer, and it informed me, in the most bureaucratic language you've ever read, that my parking pass was being placed under review for potential revocation, because my vehicle was, quote, not in compliance with the dimensional requirements of the Maplewood Creek Community Parking Facility as outlined in Section 4, Subsection 7. Paragraph C of the Community Guidelines and Regulations Handbook. My vehicle, my F-450 Super Duty with the plow mounted on the front. The truck I used to plow my own driveway, and as it happened, the driveways of about a third of my neighbors in the community. I stood there in the cold long enough that my coffee went lukewarm in my hand, reading that letter 2 more times to make sure I wasn't somehow misunderstanding it. Then I laughed. Not a real happy laugh. More like the kind of laugh you let out when you drop your phone in a puddle. The disbelief kind. My name is Pete Ellis. I've lived in Maplewood Creek for going on 6 years now. It's one of those mid-sized suburban HOA communities in northern Pennsylvania. The kind where the houses are nice enough, the streets are well paved most of the year, and things mostly run smoothly until someone on the board gets it in their head that the rules are a personal toy to play with. I moved in when the HOA was pretty low-key. The fees were reasonable, the board mostly handled actual maintenance issues, and nobody bothered you as long as you weren't painting your house neon green or leaving junk cars on the lawn. That was before Carol Whitmore got herself elected compliance officer 2 years ago. Carol lived 4 houses down from me on Ashbrook Lane, and from the moment she got that little title, something changed in her. I don't know if the power went to her head or if this was always who she was and the position just gave her an outlet, but she became a different person. She started walking the neighborhood with a clipboard. She issued written warnings to people for having garden hoses left out in the fall. She fined a retired teacher named Margie Holloway $50 because her mailbox post was 2 inches off-center. She sent a letter to the Garcias 3 houses over because their kid's basketball hoop was parked at the end of the driveway instead of inside the garage. Little things, constant things, petty things. But until now she'd never come after me directly. I wasn't naive enough to think that was a coincidence. The backstory on that requires me to back up a little. About 3 weeks before that frozen letter showed up on my door, there had been a community meeting about the HOA's budget for winter snow removal. The HOA hired a contractor every year to plow the main roads, parking areas, and common spaces inside the development. That contract was up for renewal, and Carol had gotten it in her head that she was going to push through a new vendor, a company called Pristine Property Solutions, instead of the longtime contractor, a local guy named Dan Kowalski who'd been doing the job reliably for 8 years. I did a little background checking because something smelled off. Turns out Pristine Property Solutions was co-owned by Carol's brother-in-law. And Pristine's bid was about 12% higher than Dan's, with a noticeably thinner service agreement. I stood up at that meeting and I pointed that out. Not accusatory, not loud, just factual. I pulled up the documents I'd found, online business registration records, the ownership information, both bids side by side, and I walked through it calmly. Carol went red in the face. The room went quiet, and at the end of it the vote went against Pristine Property Solutions and Dan Kowalski kept his contract. Carol smiled at me after the meeting like nothing happened, but I noticed it wasn't a real smile. 3 weeks later the letter was on my door, so yeah, not a coincidence. Now let me explain the actual situation with my truck, because Carol's complaint sounded reasonable until you understood the full picture. I owned that F-450 with the Plow as a legitimate work vehicle. I'd bought it 4 years ago partly because I got tired of paying someone else to plow my own property and partly because I'd started doing snow removal for a handful of neighbors as a side income in the winter months. Not a big operation, maybe a dozen clients in the neighborhood, all of them people who'd asked me directly because they were elderly or had bad backs or just didn't want to deal with it. I charged them fair rates, they loved the service, and everyone was happy. The community parking lot, the lot Carol was now crying foul about, was a big paved area near the entrance of the development. It had spaces for residents who needed overflow parking when their driveways were full, plus a few spaces designated for delivery vehicles. I used one of the oversized spots in the corner when I needed to park the Plow truck for short periods, usually when I was taking a quick break between jobs, warming up inside for 20 minutes, or waiting for a client to finish clearing out so I could come in and do their driveway. The spot I used was a large vehicle space. It said large vehicle parking overnight restrictions apply. I wasn't parking overnight. I was parking for 20 minutes to an hour at a stretch in a large vehicle space in the middle of the day. But according to Carol's letter, the Plow truck with the blade attached exceeded the allowable vehicle length for the community lot, and even the large vehicle spaces had a maximum posted length of 26 feet. My truck with the Plow was somewhere around 27.5 feet, depending on how you measured the blade angle. So technically, and I'm talking about a difference that could vary by a couple of inches depending on how the blade was positioned, she might have had a sliver of an argument about the posted measurement. But here's the thing. That posted measurement was on a sign that had been there for years and had never once been enforced. Half the guys in the community had trailers in that lot at various points. Delivery trucks far bigger than my setup came in and out all winter, and nobody, not once, had ever been cited for it. Nobody except me. And why now? Why in the dead of winter when I was actively plowing half the neighborhood, when those same neighbors needed my services more than ever because the temperatures were brutal and the snow was constant? It wasn't a safety issue. It wasn't causing congestion. I wasn't blocking anyone. I was using a designated large vehicle space and leaving when I was done. Carol was doing this specifically because I had embarrassed her at that budget meeting, and she was using the one thin rule she could dig up as a weapon. I didn't respond to the letter right away. I went inside, finished my coffee, pulled up the HOA governing documents on my laptop, and spent about 2 hours reading through the actual bylaws, the parking regulations, the enforcement procedures, and the appeals process. Then I drank another cup of coffee, let everything settle in my head, and started making a plan. The first thing I did was not panic and not overreact. A lot of people's first instinct when they get a letter like this is to storm over and bang on someone's door, and that never helps. It gives the other person ammunition and makes you look like the aggressor. Carol was almost certainly counting on me to do something hot-headed so she could document it and use it against me. Instead, I typed up a calm, polite, detailed written response, citing the specific sections of the bylaws, and I sent it to the full board by email, not just Carol, but all 5 board members within 48 hours of receiving her letter. The response acknowledged receipt of the notice, disputed the characterization of a violation, requested the specific written record of any previous enforcement actions related to vehicle length in the community lot for the past 3 years, as permitted under Section 9 of the governing documents, and formally stated my intent to appeal under the member appeal procedure outlined in Article 6. I was pleasant about it, professionally pleasant. The kind of pleasant that lets people know you've done your homework. Then I went and talked to my neighbors, not to organize a mob or anything dramatic. Just to let the people whose driveways I plowed know what was going on, because if Carol succeeded in revoking my parking pass, it was going to affect my ability to do my job efficiently in the neighborhood. Mrs. Carlyle at number 14 was 81 years old and had a bad hip. The Thompsons at number 22 both worked overnight shifts and couldn't plow at 6 in the morning before work. Old Ray Mendez at the end of the block had a truck but couldn't run a plow on it anymore after his shoulder surgery. These people depended on me. They were not happy when I told them what Carol was doing. Word spread fast. By the following evening, I had 3 separate neighbors call me to tell me they were planning to attend the next board meeting. By the end of the week, the informal count of residents who intended to show up and speak was somewhere around 20. And this was in the middle of a Pennsylvania winter with more snow expected. These people were motivated. While all that was building up, I kept doing my job. I kept plowing. Every storm, every morning, out in the dark before most people were awake, running my route through the neighborhood, scraping driveways clean and pushing snow to the sides. And I kept parking in that same large vehicle spot in the community lot, because my parking pass had not actually been revoked yet. The letter said it was under review, which meant it was still valid, and I made absolutely sure to document every single visit. I set up a dashcam with a wide-angle lens that captured the timestamp and my parking position every time I pulled in and out of that lot. I documented the dimensions of other vehicles parked there. I took photos of the large vehicle sign with a tape measure visible in the frame. I noted every time a contractor's truck, a delivery semi, or a vehicle with a trailer occupied that lot without incident. Carol, meanwhile, was not exactly being quiet about any of this. One of my neighbors told me she'd been going door to door in the neighborhood talking about the parking situation and implying I was somehow a safety hazard. She'd been complaining at the mailboxes. She'd even apparently called a couple of my plowing clients and suggested that I might be losing my parking access and the service disruption could be significant, which was a pretty transparent attempt to scare people off from using my service and dry up my income in the neighborhood. That one actually made me genuinely angry, because messing with my income during the busiest season of my work year, out of personal spite, after I'd done nothing wrong, was not a small thing. But I kept my composure because I had a plan, and I needed to let it play out fully. The board sent me back a letter about 10 days after my appeal request. It was signed by Carol and by the board president, a mild-mannered guy named Richard Patel, who I genuinely didn't think had bad intentions, but who was clearly in Carol's pocket on this one. The letter acknowledged my request, declined to provide enforcement history records on the grounds that they were internal board documents not subject to member review, and set a hearing date for my appeal. The hearing was scheduled for February 12th, a Thursday evening, at the community clubhouse. Here's where things started to get really interesting. One of my other neighbors, a guy named Tom Baxter who worked as a paralegal, happened to hear about the letter declining my records request, and he flagged something I'd actually already noticed but wasn't sure about. Pennsylvania HOA law, specifically under the Uniform Planned Community Act as it applies to HOA governance, gives members the right to inspect association records, including enforcement records and board meeting minutes. The HOA couldn't just declare those records off limits. Carol and Richard had either made a mistake or they were deliberately stonewalling me, hoping I didn't know better. I knew better, but it was good to have Tom's confirmation. I sent a second letter to the full board, this time more formally worded, specifically citing the applicable Pennsylvania statute and again, requesting the enforcement records within the legally required time frame. I also sent a copy to a real estate attorney friend of mine named Sandra Cheung, who I'd consulted briefly on the phone the day before, and who had, very helpfully, offered to write a brief formal follow-up on her letterhead if needed. The board caved on the record's request within 4 days. They sent me a file with the enforcement history. It was exactly what I expected. In the past 3 years, there had been 0, not 1, not 2, 0 formal enforcement actions related to vehicle length in the community parking lot. Several violations had been noted informally in meeting minutes, including one instance where a moving company truck substantially larger than mine had parked there for almost 5 hours, and the board's recorded response was no action required as the situation resolved without incident. There it was, in their own words, in their own documents. The inconsistency wasn't just implied anymore. It was documented in their own files. I made copies of everything, organized it all into a clean folder, and got ready for February 12th. In the meantime, the winter kept being the winter, which meant it kept trying to bury us all. We had 2 major storms in the 2 weeks leading up to the hearing. The first one dropped nearly a foot overnight, and the second one was a genuine nor'easter that came in sideways with wind and turned the whole development into something that looked like a snow globe someone had shaken really hard. Roads were iced over. Power flickered in and out for about 6 hours during the worst of it, and the main entrance road into Maplewood Creek had a stretch of black ice that sent 2 cars into a shallow ditch in the same afternoon. I was out before dawn both mornings, running my route, and I also, without being asked, did a pass over the main road and the community lot entrance during the second storm because the HOA's contracted plow truck was running behind. Dan Kowalski's crew was stretched thin dealing with multiple properties across town, and the community lot entrance had gotten packed up enough that people were having trouble getting in and out. I cleared it. Took me about 40 minutes. I didn't charge anyone for it. I just did it because it needed to be done. Carol, of course, saw me do it. She came out in her big puffy coat and her snow boots, and she stood at the end of her driveway watching me work. I waved at her. She did not wave back. Her own driveway, I noticed, was still unplowed. I thought about that for a second and then kept going. Not my problem. Actually, wait, that's not entirely true. Later that afternoon, one of Carol's neighbors called me and said Carol had apparently slipped on her unshoveled front steps and bruised her knee, and was very put out about the whole thing. The neighbor, Mrs. Patel, Richard's wife actually, who I got along fine with, sounded half sympathetic and half like she was trying not to laugh. I asked Mrs. Patel if she needed anything, and she said she was all taken care of and that she'd see me at the meeting. February 12th came in cold and gray and mean. It was about 12 degrees when I walked to the clubhouse, and the wind was doing that low whistling thing that means it's going to get into your bones, no matter how many layers you're wearing. The clubhouse was a big common area building near the center of the development. It had a meeting room that could hold maybe 60 people in folding chairs. When I got there 20 minutes early, there were already about 30 people inside and more coming in behind me, all of them stamping snow off their boots and peeling off scarves and hats. I set up at one of the front tables with my folder, my laptop, and a small portable projector I'd borrowed from Tom Baxter. Tom was there too, sitting a couple of rows behind me for moral support, and because, as he put it, I'm not missing this for anything. The board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Richard Patel as president, Carol Whitmore on his right as compliance officer, and 3 other board members who ranged from mildly uncomfortable to visibly nervous about the turnout. Carol was wearing a blue blazer and had her own folder in front of her, and she had that tight, controlled expression people get when they're trying to look confident while internally recalibrating. Richard called the meeting to order and introduced the agenda, which was officially listed as the parking pass compliance hearing for resident Pete Ellis. He asked if everyone was clear on the process. I said I was. Carol said she was. Richard went through the procedural intro and then gave Carol the floor first to present the HOA's position. Carol stood up, and she was actually pretty good at this. She spoke clearly, used professional language, cited section numbers. She described the parking lot's dimensional regulations, explained the posted 26-foot limit, stated that my vehicle exceeded that limit, and argued that regardless of whether previous violations had been enforced, the rule was the rule, and the HOA had both the right and the obligation to enforce it. She even acknowledged, clearly having anticipated my record's request, that there had been inconsistent enforcement in the past, but argued that inconsistent enforcement did not nullify the rule, and the board was entitled to enforce it going forward with any resident at any time. She was not wrong that inconsistent enforcement doesn't necessarily nullify a rule. I'll give her that. It was a reasonable legal position taken in the most unreasonable personal context imaginable. She sat down looking satisfied. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Richard gave me the floor. I stood up and I took a breath and I started with the facts. I walked through my parking usage dates, times, duration, always a large vehicle space, never overnight. I showed the dashcam footage on my projector, timestamps and all, showing my truck in the designated space, the space marker clearly visible, several other instances of other oversized vehicles in the lot without any action taken. I put the enforcement history documents, their own documents, on the screen, and I walked through the specific entry about the moving truck and the board's recorded response of no action required. I was calm, I was organized, and I was methodical about every single point. Then I moved into the second part, which was the part about Carol specifically. I explained, for the benefit of the board members who perhaps hadn't connected the timeline, that this enforcement action came exactly 23 days after the budget meeting at which I had opposed the snow removal contract going to Pristine Property Solutions, a company co-owned by Carol Whitmore's brother-in-law. I put the dates side by side on the projector slide. I noted that I had found no evidence, in the enforcement records or in board meeting minutes, of any discussion about vehicle size enforcement in the community lot prior to the budget meeting. I stated clearly and calmly that the timing was difficult to explain as coincidental, and that the pattern of behavior selective enforcement against a specific member immediately following that member's exercise of their legitimate governance rights was consistent with retaliation, which raised concerns both about HOA fiduciary duty and potentially about fair housing and civil liability. I didn't yell. I didn't wave my arms. I just laid it out like dominoes, one after another, and let people draw their own conclusions. The room was quiet in a way that meeting rooms don't usually get quiet. That deep, everyone holding their breath kind of quiet. Carol's face had gone through about 3 different expressions while I was talking. She landed on something between anger and alarm. Richard Patel looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else on earth. Then the public comment portion opened up and about a dozen of my neighbors spoke. Mrs. Carlisle was first, and she was 81 years old and sharp as a tack, and she told the board that Pete Ellis was the reason she hadn't slipped on an ice-covered driveway and broken a hip this winter. The Thompsons went next and talked about the early morning service. Ray Mendez went up with his arm in a sling from the shoulder and told the board that if they wanted to know who was actually keeping this community safe this winter, they should look at the guy at the table, not the person trying to revoke his pass. Tom Baxter got up and very specifically mentioned the Pennsylvania Uniform Planned Community Act and the member record access rights, noting that the board's initial refusal to provide records had also been a potential statutory violation. Every speaker was calm. Every speaker had something specific and factual to say. It wasn't a mob, it was a community. Carol tried to interrupt twice and Richard had to remind her of the public comment rules both times. After the comment period, Richard called for a closed board discussion, which they did in a side room. They were gone for about 25 minutes. The main room got loud and buzzy, people talking in groups, some laughing, some shaking their heads. Tom came and sat next to me and said, "You were extremely prepared," in a tone that suggested he'd been maybe a little worried I wasn't going to be, which honestly fair. When the board came back in, Richard looked like he'd aged about 1.5 years. He sat down, adjusted his papers, cleared his throat. The board voted 4-1 to dismiss the enforcement action against my parking pass. The one dissenting vote was Carol. There was actual applause in the room, the kind where people are just involuntarily clapping because something satisfying just happened. But here's where it got more serious, because I wasn't done, and neither, as it turned out, was this situation. About a week and a half after the hearing, Tom Baxter called me up and said he'd been doing some reading and there was something else worth looking at. He'd gone back through the board's financial records, which were also member accessible under the same statutory provisions we'd used before, and he'd found something odd. In the minutes from the October board meeting, there was a reference to a vendor services pre-authorization payment issued to Pristine Property Solutions in the amount of $4,000, described in the minutes as a planning and consulting fee. This was in October, before the budget meeting, before the vote, before Pristine had officially been awarded anything. The contract ultimately hadn't gone to Pristine, but the $4,000 payment had already gone out. It had been approved in a non-public session with only Carol and Richard present, with no formal vote by the full board, and there was no record of it ever being returned after Pristine lost the bid. That was not a petty HOA bureaucracy problem. That was a potential misappropriation of HOA funds. I got Sandra Chung on the phone that evening and walked her through what Tom had found. Sandra was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Pete, this has moved past the scope of an HOA dispute. If that payment was made from community funds without proper authorization and never returned, that's potentially fraud or theft by a fiduciary, and you should file a report." I spent 2 days organizing the financial records, the meeting minutes, the pre-authorization documentation, and everything else into a clean package. Then I called the non-emergency line for the local police department and asked to speak with someone in the financial crimes unit. A detective named Graves came to my house that Friday morning. She was quiet, professional, and very thorough. She sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee I'd poured her while she went through everything I'd laid out. She asked good questions. She didn't tip her hand about what she thought, but she took the whole package with her when she left and gave me a case reference number. The investigation took about 6 weeks total, running through the rest of February and into March. During that time, I heard almost nothing directly, but things were clearly happening. One of the other board members, a woman named Sandra Dale, who I'd always thought seemed uncomfortable with Carol's behavior, reached out to me privately and said that a detective had been in touch with her about the payment, and that she had provided all the information she had. She said she hadn't known about the pre-authorization payment and that she was deeply upset. Carol, in the meantime, had gone conspicuously quiet. No letters, no clipboard walks through the neighborhood, no door-to-door conversations. I saw her car in the driveway, but she wasn't putting herself out there. Richard Patel resigned from the board in early March. He sent a short community email citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on family. Reading between the lines was not difficult. Then one morning in the second week of March, as the weather was finally starting to ease up and the big piles of plowed snow at the edges of the roads were starting to soften at the edges, I got a text from Tom Baxter that just said, "Turn on local news." Carol Whitmore had been charged with misappropriation of fiduciary funds and 1 count of fraud. The charges were related specifically to the $4,000 payment to Pristine Property Solutions, which the investigation had established was paid from HOA common funds, without proper board authorization, to a company in which Carol's brother-in-law was a co-owner, in anticipation of a contract that Carol had been actively pushing the board to approve. When the contract fell through, thanks in no small part to what I'd presented at the budget meeting, the payment was never returned, and Carol had made no disclosure to the rest of the board that it existed. I sat with that information for a while. I wasn't triumphant about it. Someone's life getting turned upside down by criminal charges isn't something I feel good about, even when that person brought it entirely on themselves. But there was something clarifying about it, watching a situation that had started with a frozen letter on a front door and a complaint about 2.5 feet of plow truck lead all the way here. The legal process took several more months, running well past the winter. Carol was ultimately convicted on one count of misappropriation of fiduciary funds. She was ordered to make full restitution of the $4,000 to the HOA. She was fined, and she received a probationary sentence along with a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association or nonprofit board under the terms of her conviction. She resigned from the Maplewood Creek HOA board the day the charges were filed and never came back. But back in the winter, in the immediate aftermath of the hearing, and before any of that had resolved, there was still the matter of the community itself and how things were going to function going forward. The board had lost both Carol and Richard within the span of a few weeks, and there was a need to fill those seats and, more importantly, to think about how the HOA had been operating. A special election was called for late March. Sandra Dale, who'd been on the board and handled everything with integrity through the investigation, stepped up to run for board president. Several other residents threw their names in. Tom Baxter ran for the compliance officer seat, which I thought was both extremely appropriate and slightly hilarious. He campaigned on a platform of actually reading the rules before applying them, which he put on a printed flyer with complete sincerity and zero self-awareness about how funny it was. Both of them won. The new board's first order of business was a full review of the community parking regulations, conducted transparently with member input. They updated the large vehicle space signage to make the measurements clearer. They established a formal written policy about enforcement consistency, and they added language specifically requiring that enforcement actions be documented with photographic evidence and reviewed by at least 2 board members before any notice was issued to a resident. They also sent a formal written apology to every resident who had received what the new board termed an unsupported enforcement notice in the previous 2 years. The list was longer than you'd expect. Mrs. Carlisle got one about her garden hose. The Garcias got one about the basketball hoop. Margie Holloway got one about her mailbox post, and the new board voted to refund her $50 fine with interest. I got one about my plow truck. Mine was framed and put on the wall in my garage. I'm not even kidding. Right next to the pegboard with all my tools. It felt like the right place for it. Now let me walk you through the winter itself more fully, because I don't want to make this sound like it was just a series of meetings and paperwork, because it wasn't. It was actually a really hard winter on top of everything else, and the drama with Carol was just one layer running underneath a season that was already throwing everything it had at us. The storms I mentioned, the foot of snow, and then the nor'easter, were just 2 of the major weather events we got between December and March. We also had a week in late January, where the temperature dropped to -15 overnight and barely crept above single digits during the day. That kind of cold causes problems people don't always think about. Pipes freeze. Furnaces work overtime and sometimes give out. Cars won't start. Animals don't go outside. People stock up like they're bracing for the end of the world and then get a little stir-crazy 3 days in. During that cold snap, the propane situation became a community event in itself. About a dozen houses in Maplewood Creek ran on propane for heating. The development had been built in phases, and the older section used propane while the newer section was connected to natural gas. The bitter cold drove up propane consumption significantly, and the delivery company, already stretched thin across the region, fell behind on deliveries. 4 households in our section ran critically low within the same 48-hour window. One of those was old Ray Mendez and his wife Gloria. Ray had told me about the propane situation almost as a passing comment when I came by to plow his driveway, and I could tell from how he said it that he was genuinely worried but didn't want to make a big deal of it. He's that kind of guy, practical, doesn't like asking for help, doesn't complain. I asked him how low they were, and he said probably 2 or 3 days at current usage, and the delivery company's estimated window was 4 to 5 days out. I made some calls. I had a connection through my work with a propane supplier about 40 minutes north of us who occasionally did emergency deliveries for commercial customers. I explained the situation: elderly resident, extreme cold, medical concern, and they managed to fit in a delivery run the following morning. I also spread the word to 2 other neighbors who were in similar straits, and they got on the same delivery route. Nobody asked me to do any of this. I just did it because it was the thing to do. Ray shook my hand afterward, and his grip was still strong despite the shoulder, and his eyes were bright, and he said, "You're a good neighbor, Pete," which stuck with me. That's the thing about communities. They're not really the HOA. They're not the governance documents or the compliance rules or the board meeting agenda. They're the people, and the people were genuinely good here. Carol had misused her position and made people's lives harder for 2 years, but under that surface layer of friction, the community itself was solid. People looked out for each other. They showed up. They stamped the snow off their boots and drove 20 minutes in the cold for a board meeting because they cared about what kind of place they were living in. During the cold snap, I also helped 3 separate people get cars started jump starts. Nothing complicated, because that's just what happens in a neighborhood during a hard winter if you have cables and a willing engine. I also, more memorably, helped dig out a delivery driver whose minivan had gotten stuck at the entrance to Ashbrook Lane during the second big storm because the packed snow was deceptive, and he'd misjudged the turn. We spent about 40 minutes with shovels and some cardboard under the tires and got him out. He gave me a package that had actually been on its way to Mrs. Carlisle as thanks for being there, and I walked it down the street to her door. She was so happy about the delivery. It was some kind of knitting supplies she'd been waiting on, that she gave me a plate of cookies that I am pretty sure had butterscotch chips in them, which is an underrated cookie addition. The point of all of this is that winter did what winter does, and we dealt with it. And through all of it, I kept my truck on the road and my routes running and my neighbors taken care of. On the night of the board hearing, February 12th, I walked home through the cold and the dark, and I stood in my driveway for a minute before going inside, just taking stock of things. The sky had cleared off after days of gray, and there were stars out sharp and bright the way they only get when it's really cold and really clear. My breath came out in clouds. The plowed snow was piled along the edges of the street, hard packed and blue-white in the dark. Everything was still. I thought about that letter taped to my door a few weeks before, and about Carol standing at the end of her driveway watching me work, and about the look on Richard Patel's face when the vote came down. I thought about Mrs. Carlisle and Ray and Tom Baxter, and all the people who'd shown up in the cold for a community meeting because they gave a damn. I thought about how a 27.5-foot truck had somehow become the center of all of this, which was objectively pretty funny if you looked at it from the right angle. Then I went inside and made some dinner and went to bed early because I had driveways to do in the morning. Let me tell you about the spring cleanup day, because it's how this whole thing really ended in a way that felt finished. Every year, Maplewood Creek did a community cleanup day in late March or early April when the last of the snow was gone, and the grounds were ready for it. It was a volunteer thing. People came out with rakes and trash bags and did light landscaping around the common areas, cleaned up the winter debris, spread mulch around the entrance plantings. Usually it was a pretty low-key, moderate turnout event, organized by whoever on the board was responsible for grounds maintenance. This year, with the new board in place and the winter everyone had just been through, Sandra Dale and the rest of the board decided to make it a bigger deal. They sent out a real invitation, not just a notice, but an actual invitation with some friendly language about fresh starts and community spirit. They organized food, someone donated coffee and donuts, someone else brought a big thing of chili that they set up in a slow cooker inside the clubhouse. There was a sign-up sheet, and it had a completely unreasonable number of names on it. I showed up with a wheelbarrow and a pair of work gloves, and ended up spending most of the morning helping clear the debris around the community parking lot, which had some real accumulation of gravel and sand from the winter plowing, and needed a proper cleanup. Tom Baxter was there with a rake and a very serious expression, taking his first official grounds oversight moment as compliance officer extremely earnestly, which made me laugh every time I looked at him. Ray and Gloria Mendez came out for an hour even though Ray's shoulder was still healing. Gloria brought tamales wrapped in foil, and they were outstanding, and several people made immediate requests for the recipe which she declined to share with polite finality. Mrs. Carlisle sat in a lawn chair near the entrance with a thermos of tea and served as what she called the supervisory committee, which meant she told people when they'd missed a spot and thanked everyone who walked by. She had the authority of a retired school teacher, and nobody argued with her about anything. The parking lot itself, the lot that had been the nominal flashpoint for everything, got cleaned up and restripped. The new board had contracted to have the faded lines repainted and the large vehicle spaces respecified with the updated clearer measurements. The new signs went up that same day. They were clean and readable, and the measurements were right there in plain text and made complete logical sense. I helped bolt one of the new signs to its post. The compliance officer, my friend Tom, standing there with a ratchet set and a slightly too large hard hat he'd found in his garage, officially declared the sign properly installed and wrote it in his notepad, which he was keeping as a formal record. He looked so profoundly satisfied with this that I didn't have the heart to tell him the hard hat was about 3 sizes too big and kept sliding down over his eyes. We worked most of the morning and into early afternoon. The weather was perfect mid-40s, sunny, the ground still soft from all the snow that had been on it for months, that specific smell of early spring in the Northeast where everything is starting to breathe again after being frozen. There was mud in the low spots. The grass was starting to show through at the edges of the plowed areas, pale green and tentative. By the time most people started wrapping up and heading inside for the chili, I stood back and looked at the parking lot and the entrance area and the main road through the development, all of it clean and properly maintained and ready for whatever came next. It looked like a real community, because it was one. The thing about HOAs, and I say this as someone who now had a deeply personal relationship with the concept, is that they can be run really well or they can be run really badly, and the difference is almost entirely about the people in charge, and whether those people understand that the authority they have is supposed to serve the community, not the other way around. An HOA governance structure isn't inherently bad. The rules about parking and landscaping and maintenance exist for actual reasons. But when somebody gets it in their head that the rules are a personal lever to pull against people they don't like, the whole thing goes wrong in a hurry. Carol Whitmore had made it personal, and it had backfired on her completely, and not because of anything underhanded I did. Because I documented things, because I knew the rules better than she expected, because the community showed up when it mattered, and because the truth happened to be both simple and very well documented. The parking pass that had been under review for potential revocation sat in my glove compartment the whole winter, valid and untouched, and I kept using it to park my plow truck in the large vehicle space between jobs, and nobody ever said a word about it again. After the cleanup day, I drove home in my F450 and parked it in my own driveway. The sun was still out and the temperatures were climbing, and I could see the last of the dirty snow piles at the edges of the road starting to shrink in real time, meltwater running along the gutters. I sat in the cab for a second before cutting the engine, just looking at the neighborhood through the windshield. 6 years I'd lived here, and until about 3 months ago, I couldn't have told you what was in Section 4, Subsection 7, Paragraph C of the Community Guidelines. Now I could probably recite it from memory. I knew the entire appeals process, the enforcement history requirements, the Pennsylvania statutes on member record access, the fiduciary obligations of HOA board members, and the specific language around selective enforcement. Not because I'd planned to need any of that. Because someone decided to tape a letter to my door in the middle of a blizzard and mess with my livelihood over a grudge. And when that happens, you either crumble or you figure things out. I figured things out. Dan Kowalski, by the way, kept his snow removal contract, and the HOA extended it for 2 more years at the next budget meeting. He sent me a 6-pack of good craft beer in February, which I considered an entirely appropriate thank you gift, and consumed over the course of a very peaceful weekend, once the worst of the season was done. Tom Baxter served out the rest of the term as compliance officer, with a level of thoroughness that I'm pretty sure raised the overall organizational standard of the HOA by about 40%, though his insistence on maintaining a written log of every conversation related to his duties was a personality trait that took some getting used to. Sandra Dale turned out to be an excellent board president, organized, fair, communicative. She instituted quarterly open meetings where residents could bring concerns in an informal setting before they became formal disputes. Turnout was consistently solid. People actually liked coming to them. That felt new. Mrs. Carlisle completed her knitting project, a blanket, it turned out, for her new great-grandchild, and told me about it in enough detail that I now know more about cable knit patterns than I ever expected to. She also asked me if I'd be plowing again next winter, and I said yes, and she said good, and that was that. Ray Mendez got his shoulder cleared by his doctor in June and spent most of the summer rebuilding a vintage motorcycle in his garage, which was loud and wonderful and felt like a real symbol of things getting back to being fine. And me, I kept doing what I'd always done. Work the truck, clear the driveways, take care of the neighbors, show up when people needed things. Nothing glamorous about it. Just the actual work of being part of a place. That frozen letter, the one that tore the paint off my door, I ended up leaving the paint chip on the front door unrepaired through the rest of the winter. It was a small thing, barely the size of a quarter, and it drove me a little crazy to look at it, but I left it there until the spring cleanup day, and then I touched it up myself that same evening with a brush and a small can of matching paint from the hardware store. Took about 20 minutes, turned out perfectly. The door looked good. The neighborhood looked good. The parking lot with its new signs and fresh lines looked good. Winter was over. The truck was mine. The pass was valid. And Carol Whitmore's name was off the board and out of our lives, replaced by a compliance officer in a badly fitted hard hat who kept a written log and genuinely believed in doing things by the book. All things considered, I'll take it.